Hey folks, Kevin here. Well, it's March 27th, 2019. I'm out in the Lower North workshop. Today I'm going to share with you a couple of the challenges I encountered yesterday when I was putting up this plywood and adding some more wiring and hooking up some wiring that went through these studs here. So as a basic recap, initially this building was built, it was renovated, 20 some odd years ago with 2x6 construction. So 2x6 vertical studs, 16 inches on center, and then textured 111 like a plywood attached to the outside of the building for the structural sheathing. When we first had the renovations done, I decided to put in fire and security systems, so I put that in, and so that wiring was within the studs. Now I pulled all other wiring except for the security fire protection wires that came up through this area, went up and go across the floor, and one other place in the back of the building. My thoughts at that time was I probably won't run into any problems with it. The only other places that there's where I left the wires in place, mainly because of ease of use, is the places where we have door contacts. So when we open and close the door, there's a magnetic implant placed inside of this part of the door, and then there's a magnet with contact wires that go through out into the studs. And because of the challenges of pulling all that wiring out, I left it in between the 3 layers of polyisocyanurate rigid foam insulation board between the studs. This is another layer that sits on the surface of it, and then we have horizontal studs and vertical studs. So I left those wires in there thinking, geez, I know exactly where they are. Chances of having a problem are remote at best. All other wires have been pulled out of all of the studs all the way around the building, but where all the doors are, that I left intact. And the only other thing is that probably wasn't a great idea is these vertical studs here are almost sitting directly on top of the vertical studs below. They're just offset by 1.5 inches, which I thought at that time was a great idea. So on the outside of this building, I put in 4-inch, now this is a square one, receptacles for installing exterior lighting. And when I put all the insulation in, I took 2 pieces of the Romex wire and shoved them through the multiple layers of insulation, and they go right up against that stud that's here, because the stud is where that receptacle can is being mounted to. So I had that all set. Unfortunately, I left the horizontal stud, which that wire comes right through the center of it, and this one here I ended up notching out. I thought that would be good. I left just enough of a hole in those boards, in the horizontal board, that the 2 pieces of Romex could fit through easily, slide back and forth. So when I took out the 2 pieces that were placeholders, I could run the new wires through them as well. So all of these wires weren't here yesterday, and you'll see that in the GoPro footage. And what you'll see is me taking some of the wires that were laying across that were hooked up temporarily with some of the other security system and network cables and telephone cables I had laying off to the side. I strung them up, put them up here, took the security panel here, and that's a security panel where I had the offset colors that I talked about. There were different color wire connectors in the back of it than my traditional colors. And I took a photograph of that yesterday, and that panel comes in important in this story. So the first thing I did was I had a 4-gang box. So this is a 2-gang square non-metallic plastic receptacle holder with retaining tabs in it. So they help to lock down and secure the tabs. This is one of my old 4-gang fiberglass unit. It's 35 years old or so, and this passed code just fine. It has the metal retaining brackets that hold the wires, so there were penetrations where the wires came through. And when I got these studs up, I said, well, I'll just use this one again. Well, when I checked the code, there's really a couple reasons why I'm not using this, but number one is the volume inside of this is much less than the volume inside of this one. So hopefully you can see the difference in the depth of it, in the height of it, and in the depth of it. So the volume is greater in the newer boxes than the older fiberglass ones, and therefore I'm not going to get into trouble with the number of wires that go into these units. The other thing that I decided to do, I knew I needed 3 gangs, and the way I've designed the system, if I need to put 2 more in, I can easily do that with that removable panel that goes above here, 1 foot tall panel. So modification's really easy. So one thing that I knew I needed to do was, one, I'm going to have all 4 entrance doors. So I have one on the north face, the south face, the east face, and the west face. And I use all those doors because I drive up around each side with pieces of equipment, and I elect to come in through those doors at different times. And so what I'll end up doing is using 2 3-way switches and 2 4-way switches to have all the main lights that light up the main walkways through here. I'll have those all on a 4 different switches, 2 3-ways and 2 4-ways, that will power the system. And I've already have a power going to the one on the south wall, so I didn't want any more power coming into this unit, since it's just going to be a 3-way switch here, and it's not going to need any line input here. So nothing coming from the electric panel is what I mean. This switch here, I know I need to have 2 switches. One switch that's going to turn on and off the outside lights that I already mentioned, and the other switch is going to be, ultimately it'll be a 3-way switch as well for upstairs and downstairs, but for right now, until I remodel the upstairs, it'll be just a standard light switch to turn on and off the lights upstairs. So, and then I put in one more receptacle over there. So the first challenge was realizing that I really wanted to make sure that I use the appropriate boxes. One, dividing the sources of power. So this one has a source from another location, and this is going to be one of the multiple switches that can turn on the main lights. This will control 2 switches, one for the outside lights and one for the second floor lights. Whereas if I put all the switches in one continuous box, I'd have problems with meeting code and having overpower, and I'd have the possible confusion in the future when I have an electrical problem or someone else has a problem here, and they see, geez, here we got this 3-way switch and those other 2 4-way switches and another 3-way switch. And if you have a great big box and you have power coming in to power these 2 here, well, they might assume that the power also goes to this, which could create some confusion as well. So I decided to separate those out. So hopefully that makes sense. So now on to the other problem I had. So I got those set. I got the wires hooked up coming over to here. So the power comes from the panel over there. It comes over and it feeds a receptacle right up here, which is going to be one of the cameras. And then the power comes from that outlet, comes down to this double switch here, and then goes over to that room, which is going to be an isolated room, and powers up the electrical outlets there. And that's all 20 amp, all on one breaker. Hank's keeping an eye on the property. So the problem I had was when I took those 2 wires and I tried taping first one of the 2 new wires that feed to the outside. So one wire coming from the switch here goes out to that light switch, and one comes back in and goes over to the light switch on the other side of the door. I could not get those wires to go through that hole. I made it too tight and all. And I played with it for a little while. And then ultimately, I grabbed my auger bit and I pulled the wires out, and I opened up the hole a little bit more so that the wires could go through. They fit through there beautifully. At the time, it was below freezing, of course, so all the doors were closed in here, and I noticed my little green light saying everything was okay was off. So I opened and closed the door a few times, and you didn't hear that chime, and it didn't reset and say everything's secure. So I knew that I lost my door contact. And fortunately, every one of these systems that I've installed, like you'll see, even though I'm securing the wires within 8 inches of the electrical boxes that are there, the receptacle boxes, I leave loops so that if I ever have any problems, I can always pull more wire out through. I do the same thing when I put in all my security wires. So I had drilled through this, I had cut through the wire that was a door contact that came from up above and came down to here, and the wire that came through and was right here at this location heading its way up there. Fortunately, there was still a loop in there. So I got a large pair of hemostats. I used a vacuum cleaner first to clean out the hole so I could see. I used a flashlight, and I used a pair of hemostats, and I was able to grab a hold of that wire, and although it was tough to pull because the loops were in between the layers of insulation, and I planned in case there's ever a problem I could always pull some extra wire, so I was able to pull both ends of the wire out, splice it, put it back together, and I got my security system back. So having extra loops of wire, I think, is potentially a lifesaver later on when the unexpected actually happens. Who'd have thought that door contact security wire would have been right in the location where those two wires were, because they didn't appear to be near there when I installed the system. But since it was so close to the stud, that auger bit must have just grabbed a hold of the edge of it and pulled it in. So those are the challenges I had yesterday. I did have, in a previous video, I talked about the pressure treated boards that are on the floor. They were frozen solid when I got them, and it's still pretty darn cold here, but we did have a couple of days where they started thawing, but the moisture content is still high. So two variables when you're dealing with a concrete floor in a building and you're dealing with moist lumber that's on that contact floor. So the first thing is when floors are poured, typically we put a level margin around the perimeter of the room or the building that we're putting in, and that way we can screed or level the surface of the rest of in the central part of the floor out using a screeding board going back and forth and maintaining the level. Well, unfortunately, it's never perfect, so there's little dips and hills and valleys, very, very subtle to see. But if you were to take a perfect level, let's say a 15-foot level, and put it across the board, you'd see there's places where it's down an eighth of an inch or up an eighth of an inch and all. That, along with the pressure-treated boards having a higher moisture content, and I know that they're going to shrink over time. The point is that I ended up using the sledgehammer to move this plywood in where it was most swollen and where there was a little hill in the concrete. Therefore, I was able to maintain a level height for the top of the plywood panel, and it would just be super snug in the places where I had to use a sledgehammer to put it in. And I used boards to brace it to get it to persuade the panel to go in there, knowing that that pressure treated board is going to dry out in the future. Otherwise, either I would have had an unlevel top of the plywood, or I would have had a gap below it later on. So that's about it. So all of the footage that'll show up here, just a little music with a little GoPro footage going through the process. You'll see some of my back in the process, unfortunately, because I just used one camera yesterday when I was doing this. So that's about it. So if you have any comments or questions, please leave them below. I'll put a link in the upper right hand corner to the series, the workshop series that I started here. And I hope you enjoyed the video, and share it with your friends. Hit the bell icon if you want to be notified in the future. And by all means, folks, have a great day. Bye-bye now.